Hi everyone. For this reflection, I would like to highlight a couple of key concepts and ideas from Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility book that have helped me to better view and understand race and racism within the context of my personal and professional lives. One of the key ideas that stood out to me is how I have been culturally socialized to understand and participate in these rules of engagement when it comes to discussing race and racism, specifically in white circles. I have experienced what DiAngelo describes when you're in the context of white family members or white friends and a racial or a prejudiced joke or comment surfaces. And in order to have a authentic, productive, honest conversation about that, you have to have all of these like magical elements first. You have to have this strong foundation of trust between you and that person. You have to approach the comment or joke in a very indirect and private way. You cannot bring it up in the context that it happened. You almost have to wait later and approach that person privately, or else you risk a hostile environment, being isolated from the group, being seen as overly sensitive or like this liberal, woke, undesirable perspective at the table. And this isn't all encompassing of all the white people that I know and all the discussions that I've been a part of, but in reading that chapter in DiAngelo's book, it really highlighted how I have accepted those rules of engagement and contributed to conversations like that simply through silence and letting the fear of confrontation and conflict trump an opportunity to have a much needed conversation around race and racism. And one of the things that I like that Robin talked about is when you do decide to approach someone, you always have to start with yourself. It's not necessarily about how do I take all of this information and delineate it down to the most important facts and figures and then effectively communicate it out to every single white person that I know. It's more about being self-reflective and how do we contribute to, this socialization in our culture. And then using those examples of self-reflection and self-growth to inform conversations with other people. You know, this is how I used to see race and racism. This is how I see it now playing out in my life and in our culture as a whole. I thought that was really helpful for me. The second thing that I really enjoyed in the reading was learning more about this idea of habitus and how we determine power dynamics from constant repetition of behaviors and perceptions and assumptions about people in any given context. And I work in an art museum, and it made me think about how different groups of people coming from different cultural backgrounds, different races, different ethnicities, different advantaged and disadvantaged groups may let this idea of habitus inform how they feel in a museum space. Like the power dynamic in a museum has traditionally been the curator who has more knowledge about the piece of artwork or has more education related to that field would have more power in that space. And historically, the majority of art historians and curators have been white. And so how does that impact visitors who come from disadvantaged communities and racial groups? How do we shift those power dynamics to make someone feel like they belong in that space, that their voice matters, that their perspective matters, that there's not necessarily just the white normative lens to look at art through, that what we're seeing and what we're experiencing can be applied in a variety of different ways to a variety of different racial groups, and that the power can be shifted back to the viewer and not necessarily the curator or the artist or things like that. And so it was interesting to me to learn a little bit more about that and relate it to my personal life and my professional life. And I think moving forward, my last key takeaway is, how do I shift from this good, bad binary narrative, and instead of being concerned about how I am perceived in the world in regards to my race and my, unconscious acts of prejudice and bias in the world, instead of being so concerned with how I'm perceived and following this good, bad binary, instead, I would love to take on Robin DiAngelo's perspective of feedback and be more open and willing to hear the message that is being provided over how the message is delivered. I think she says something like, the way that you provide feedback to me is irrelevant. Like, I want the content and the context of what you're providing. And even though it might make me uncomfortable, or it might trigger this resistance based on negative perceptions, I am here to sit in the space with you and take it anyway. And that's the only way that we can grow. And if we're not strong enough now, we have to build up the racial stamina to be strong enough for those conversations and that feedback. So all in all, I really enjoyed the reading, and it showed a lot of areas in my life that I can personally grow and also share that growth with others. So thank you.